Really excited to join us for a conversation about the Title VII ruling from last Monday and really what it means for LGBTQ Missourians. So thank you for taking time out of your Tuesday evening to join us, to have conversation, hopefully be able to answer your questions. So as we all know, on June 15th, the Supreme Court here in the United States affirmed that Title VII prohibits employees from discriminating against LGBTQ individuals under the definition of sex discrimination. So tonight we're going to be able to talk about how this ruling not only protects millions of LGBTQ Americans, but also protects over 180,000 LGBTQ Missourians in employment. So with us, we have our Executive Director, Stephen Eisel, and our Manager of Public Policy, Samadi Niamchai, who I'm going to moderate discussion. We're going to talk about really what this means moving forward, what it means for Missourians, and really be able to answer any of the questions that you all have submitted and continue to submit. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll be able to answer those as well. So just to get started, Stephen, can you kind of give us the groundwork and the background on the three cases that were decided on last Monday and what that means?
Absolutely. So thank you for that introduction, Karis, and welcome to everyone that's joining us this evening. As was said, my name is Stephen Eisel, the Executive Director of Promo, and really excited to be able to be a part of this conversation this evening and just let people understand a little bit more about the decision from last week. And I think we've seen a lot of media coverage, but I will say one thing that I've seen, even in the 7-8 days now, I guess, since the case, is we're learning a little bit more each day about the full impact of this case and just how big of a win for the LGBTQ community that it really was. So as was said, this was actually 3 different cases that were really combined into one. This was heard early in the Supreme Court's calendar this year, and we had been waiting for a ruling on these 3 cases for some time. We knew that it was going to be coming on a Monday, maybe on a Thursday. At some point by the end of June, so we were really excited to see this come out. And we had been anticipating a couple of different options that could have come out. So they could have ruled, they could have split the 3 cases into different pieces. They could have taken one element or another. So I think what we saw was the 3 cases were combined into one and really one ruling. And I think that was one thing that I think surprised a lot of us was just how clear-cut this case was in deciding that sex discrimination included both sexual orientation and gender identity. I know one of the other things we had been waiting for with breath, I would say, was would include one or the other, neither, both. So I think that having both of them enumerated kind of in the ruling was a very strong case and a very strong decision. One thing I do want to note, in addition to taking the time to celebrate a ruling of this caliber and of this level is also knowing the context that we're finding ourselves in. Obviously, we're in Pride Month where a lot of Pride activities have been canceled or postponed or moved online. So I want to be cognizant of also understanding, what's happening, especially within the Black community and how we, as an equality organization, as an LGBTQ organization, are also aware of the discrimination that still exists for other protected classes within our society, and making sure that we're understanding where we find this ruling in that context as well. But the last thing I would say before passing it back as well is just the fact that I think it's important for us to also remember that 2 of the 3 plaintiffs in these cases passed away before they got their ruling, before they got their day in court. So I think it's important for us to remember that it is a very long path to the Supreme Court and certainly to get a ruling. So I think it's important for us to remember both Donald Zarda and Amy Stevens, who unfortunately passed away before they were able to see this victory. So I just want to remind folks of that as well.
Yeah, we often talk about how the work towards equality is marathon work. And I think that is definitely a part of that. And we do want to honor them and not only their bravery, but the work to get to that point, even though they didn't get to see the victory. So we know that the decision made last Monday on the 15th was a 6-3 decision. What did that decision say, Stephen?
Sure. So really, I think what was most exciting about this is that so under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Justice Gorsuch, who was a Trump appointee, someone who we weren't quite sure exactly how he might come down on this case, was actually the lead author, and was joined by the kind of four more liberal justices, as well as Chief Justice John Roberts. So, as you said, a 6-3 decision, and it was about 30 pages in length with about 100-page dissent that I think many of us are still working through that part of the case to see exactly what was in there. But found that sex discrimination under Title VII includes both sexual orientation and gender identity. One thing that I read in the dissents so far is that there are about 100 federal statutes that prohibit discrimination based on sex. So one of the things that I think we're really interested in seeing is exactly what from this ruling in Title VII, especially around employment discrimination. So I think that's the important thing for people to understand, that we are talking about employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. We still have work to do, and we'll get a little bit further into this part of the conversation in a minute around housing and public accommodation and things like that. But I think one of the interesting pieces about the argument and ruling as well was the fact that Justice Gorsuch kind of refers to himself as a textualist. So he made a very a plain text argument versus what can be described as legislative intent. So instead of saying, this is what Congress thought in 1964 and kind of drawing conclusions from that, he said, sex discrimination means sexual orientation and gender identity. Made it very clear, and I think that is one thing that surprised a lot of us that were awaiting this decision, was just really given a number of different examples, and not just in the plaintiff's case, but also other examples within his writings as to how this would apply and why it's so important. So again, just a really big ruling for our community, and something that we should be able to celebrate and understand what work we still have to do.
Perfect. And I think that leads me to wonder, and I'm sure many folks who are on joining us this evening to wonder, how much does this affect Missourians? So Samadi, can you kind of explain, this is a really big win for Missourians, because Missourians, all across the state, haven't been fully protected in employment besides some patchwork of ordinances. So can you kind of talk about, what has Missouri done before to protect the LGBTQ community, and the kind of a little bit of the impact on this before we kind of move forward about effects here?
Sure. So like Kara said, my name is Samadi Miyamcha. I'm the manager of public policy at Promo. He, him, his pronouns. And what have we done in Missouri before? Some cities and counties have protections in employment, housing, and public accommodations. So that's places like St. Louis City, Kansas City, Columbia, I believe, a couple of municipalities in the county, St. Joe. We don't, unfortunately, it's really a patchwork. So I like to say that, when I go to Jeff City when the legislature is in session, when I drive from St. Louis City through the county and I arrive in Jeff City, my protections based on my sexual orientation kind of fade away as I get closer to Jeff City, which is a little poetic if you look at it that way. But that's also not fair, right? It shouldn't depend on where I live or where I'm going for me to not be denied a place to live or a job or a basic public service like getting gas or going to the grocery store. Which is why we've worked really hard over many years to try to pass the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act, or also called MONA. It was last voted on in the Senate in 2013. We've been trying very hard to get another vote on it since, but it's like Kara said earlier, it's more of a marathon than a sprint. So we're working very hard, but that's kind of where we are at with what Missouri has done so far.
Thank you, Samadi. And I know, Stephen, you talked a little bit about there were some surprises in last week's decision. But what does this mean for Missourians today in the place of employment? Who's covered? Maybe how they're covered. And Samadi, I'd like for you to also be able to take some time and talk about that as well. But go ahead. I'm curious. What does it mean for Missourians today, both of you?
Yeah, so I think you maybe mentioned the number before. There's about 180,000 Missourians that would benefit from this ruling. So I think it was about half of states had employment discrimination for sexual orientation and gender identity already. Missouri was not one of those states, as Samadi just described. So it patchwork, not just within Missouri, but really across the country. So I think that this provided more clarity, especially in a state like ours, in terms of hiring, firing, other parts of employment. So, pay and other things like that. That sexual orientation, gender identity, if that is one of the rationales behind it, is now illegal. And being able to have that protection. One thing that I heard, I think, on another call that was one of the things that used to be said after the marriage decision is that you could get married on Sunday and get fired on Monday. And I think one of the things I heard on a call last week, and especially as we were kind of digesting the 1557 rule, which I think we'll talk about in a minute as well, is that you could have gotten fired on Friday and then had those protections on. It was a really kind of interesting thing for us to put into context about what this means for our everyday lives and just, how important employment is for so many of us, and to be able to have this really explicitly stated from the highest court in the land and from a conservative justice on top of that in a 6-3 decision, I think was just a momentous day for us in being able to process exactly what that means in our lives. I know, I've heard conversation from folks that have been fired for coming out before, and knowing that they have those positions, I think it's just such a big win for us moving forward.
So Samadi, what do you see as, your manager of public policy here on the promo team? What do you, see this means for LGBTQ Missourians today in protections as well?
It means a lot. It says the highest court in the country says that based on current federal law, you shouldn't be fired because of your sexual orientation or gender identity. And I know a lot of the news has said, just to add this pin in it, I know a lot of the news has said like gay and transgender folks. This covers anyone regardless of sexual orientation, however someone identifies, and however someone identifies their gender identity, whether they're transgender, gender non-conforming, gender non-binary. This says that you cannot fire someone based on federal law. It does still mean, however, we can be denied housing or public accommodations. And we are still trying to figure out this as well. So an example I give is if I were denied a job or fired from my job because of my race, and in St. Louis City, I would go to my equal opportunity office and file a complaint. And so there'd be some kind of process to ensue, and that is based off of both federal standard and state standards in policy. If I were denied a place to live based on my sexual orientation or gender identity, that gets a little more complicated. I would have to file a federal complaint, most likely, and that's just going to take longer. Stephen highlighted that earlier, that 2 of the 3 people that filed these cases that got to the Supreme Court passed before they were able to hear the decision and get justice. It would still take a long time, but at least if I were able to file in Missouri, I wouldn't have to go to like a federal level or a higher level person to get justice for my unjust discriminatory termination.
Thank you for that explanation, Samadi. And I know that we're talking about several gaps here, right? Like we have a path when it comes to employment now, very clear, but a lot of things are still unclear. What other gaps maybe are still remaining that we haven't brought up quite yet that people should be aware of that affects us here in Missouri?
Unfortunately, quite a few. Like we already talked about housing and public accommodations protections, and we've heard public accommodations is kind of it sounds really technical. Basically, in Missouri, under the Missouri Human Rights Act, that covers gas stations, movie theaters, a restaurant, a store. You can't be turned away based on your race, so you have, or other factors. But unfortunately, you still can be based on your sexual orientation or gender identity. This doesn't cover, in terms of at least larger things, doesn't cover anything about like transgender military service. As Stephen will talk about later, I think with the 1557 decision, nothing about general medical care. we know that we at Promo know that conversion therapy is still a significant concern for many young and older Missourians. And oh, this is something significant as well. This past legislative session, we faced one of the most challenging sessions, both as a community and as an organization. We had over 19 bills filed, and then toward even during the pandemic, there were still additional attacks on LGBT rights, from transgender youth playing sports to medical care, transgender-related medical care for trans kids, changing your gender marker, foster care and adoption. There are still other areas of life that aren't covered by employment where we can still face some significant challenges.
Thank you. Thank you for outlining that, because I know that there are a lot of questions of how much does this affect other pieces when we have a ruling here on employment. Again, still a huge victory and a big win, but there are still pieces that I think we need to keep in mind. And this isn't, you know, Stephen, you've mentioned this is not, you know, the only ruling that we've had from the Supreme Court and, you know, from other courts when it comes to the LGBTQ community. Can you talk about also a little bit more how this compares and what maybe even this looks like moving forward, or how this ruling might affect us even more so in the future?
Sure. So I believe it was the year actually I first came out was the year that Lawrence v. Texas was decided. That was 2003. Which decriminalized same-sex relationships. Up until that time, there were many states where really same-sex relationships were still illegal, and that's really not that long ago in the scheme of you know, our movement for LGBTQ rights. And we've had a couple other high-profile cases in the last decade or more. So the other names you kind of hear often are the Windsor case or the Obergefell case. Windsor was the Defense of Marriage Act, so that was struck down, and then the Obergefell led to marriage equality nationwide for same-sex relationships. So I would say arguably this case is bigger than any of those other cases, and I think that that is partially because not everyone is employed. You know, that's part of it. Or not everyone gets married, but, you know, there are jobs are kind of affects more people. And I think the clarity around this law in terms of what sex discrimination means and the ability to kind of make that clear line for cases going forward. So I know there's other cases working through the courts that look at Title IX as it pertains to education. As we talked about before on Friday, before this court case came down, the Trump administration had come out with its final rule around Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. So what that had done, so in 2016, the Obama administration had actually said that basically transgender care was lawful and could not be denied under the Affordable Care Act. And the Trump administration last Friday changed that ruling back and kind of reinterpreted that in denying that care. But the language that's used within the Affordable Care Act is very similar to what is under Title VII. So I think that there are a number of court cases kind of making their way through the district courts or the circuit courts that are likely to have an impact on employment, housing, credit, other federally funded programs. So I think that there's an opportunity to use the language as it was defined in this case under Gorsuch to bring other cases up that would expand these rights out to members of our community in other spaces of our life. So, you know, employment is one part of our life, and that's why I think that this has been such a big case for so many people. And it's even bigger because it has that implication that other cases in the future are probably going to be able to use this language to expand those rights back to us in other parts of our life.
Perfect. So what I'm hearing is that some of the biggest victory in the ruling that we had with Title VII is really the clarity it brings to the definition and being able to use that and moving forward in definitions of sex discrimination in other aspects like Title IX and things of that nature. And I know for many folks, even something like the Masterpiece case where we expected not too long ago a very clear decision, it was very specific. And so it sounds like, you know, so many of our past rulings have been very specific and then in this case, this is pretty clear, and we can use this in the future to make sure that we can keep folks protected. So we have a couple of questions about 1557 of when that goes into effect.
Yeah, so I don't know the exact date that those final rules, because I know that that's a long process. So the way that kind of any sort of administrative change at that level that kind of makes its way through the system, it's a proposed rule that has both kind of a state comment period, a federal comment period that are open. I believe we probably submitted comment, I think at that point a while back. And then the final rule gets announced, and then there's a period of time before that really goes into effect. The one thing that I don't have full clarity on at this point, just to speak candidly for folks, and something that we could look more into, is there's also the Congressional Review Act, which within a certain amount of time between, and it pertains to legislative days, so this gets a little bit weedy, but kind of working backwards from a presidential election, Congress has the opportunity afterward to kind of go back and clarify or even annul some of these final rules and those changes and things like that. So I don't have the full information on that, but I think the guidance that we've been given from others is really to keep going and seeing your doctor, your physician, like talking to your health insurance, whatever the case may be, that we should be looking at this as if nothing has changed because of this court ruling. So I would encourage people to continue to seek out the care, and knowing that there's going to be a court argument that follows this afterward.
Thank you for that clarification. I think that's really helpful for folks that, I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and the concept of healthcare and being protected in healthcare is important. And so for this, this decision around the same time as us being in the midst of a pandemic is really scary. So thank you for, saying that is really important in timeline. So let's say I, as an LGBTQ, worker here in Missouri, was fired from a previous job for my sexual orientation and/or my gender identity. Is there a statute of limitations on my discrimination case, maybe that happened a while back? What does that look like moving forward for those of us who've been discriminated against in the past, maybe not looking forward?
Yeah, so I believe the statute of limitations on a case of this type is 5 years. So that's kind of the window of opportunity people have if they've faced a similar situation. And then Samadhi, I'm not sure if you have more detail as to kind of what that process looks like. I know like St. Louis City, there's an opportunity, there's a specific office that people can go to talk about this and what they might be able to do at the state or national level on that front.
So that's kind of where it gets complicated. Certain cities or municipalities or counties will have some kind of human rights or equal opportunity office where they can file a complaint, and then steps will be taken to mediate that situation. If you live in a municipality or district or county that doesn't have that office or those protections, I believe you have to go to the Federal Equal Opportunity Commission and file a complaint there.
Thank you, Samadhi. And I want to let everyone know who's also joining us that we do have, if you go to promoonline.org, under resources, we do have a space where you can report discrimination. So if you've experienced discrimination based on your sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, and you are seeking resources, you need to know what your next steps are, you need help with that process, please do not hesitate to submit that form, and a member of our promo team will be able to help you and assist you in pointing you in the right direction of how to be able to move forward. That's part of what we do as a statewide advocacy organization. So just know that that is a resource. If you've experienced discrimination, please feel free to go to our website and we can go ahead and help you when you submit a form there as well. Because this does kind of feel a little bit like a patchwork still, even with a clear ruling. And so it can feel really confusing and it's very new. So just know that we're your advocates and we're here to help you through that process. Now, again, kind of longer term, what does this mean for, for Missourians? Stephen, you talked about how this, really will help, with future rulings and things like that. We've mentioned a couple of things. Is there anything else that we haven't mentioned that it might affect that we need to keep in mind as well here in Missouri?
Yeah, so I think to that point, as I said, there's a handful of cases that are really working their way through the courts now that I think got much stronger because of this ruling. So I think that there are going to be some opportunities to look at other cases that, I'm trying to think exactly. I don't know that I have some of the names of those cases in front of me at the moment, but certainly some of those that pertain to public accommodations, housing. I know that we had been expecting a rule from Housing and Urban Development. So there was guidance that I believe was in proposed rule state currently that the Trump administration was actually looking at that would deny people access to federally funded temporary shelters or homeless shelters based on their gender identity or gender markers. So I know that the language in this case I think has pretty strong implications. The way we've described 1557 also has really strong implications for that particular rule. So, not just in the courts, but also around kind of legislation and rulemaking. I think that there's a lot of places within law where this is going to have an impact playing out.
Thank you. And Samadi, every single year at Promo, we talk about the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act. We've been talking about it for about 22 years now to be able to add sexual orientation and gender identity onto our human rights statute. I mean, what does this mean for the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act moving forward, looking to 2021?
Great question, which I've said this a few times now. Just because of the SCOTUS decision, we do not have housing or public accommodations protections. That is in other sections of the Federal Civil Rights Act, and that is protected in certain areas. That is protected for certain identities in the Missouri Human Rights Act. Those are two huge reasons why we need MONA. We know that a lot of transgender Missourians, especially, and transgender people across the country, have been denied housing and places to live because of their gender identity, and that's not okay, and that needs to stop. And we need MONA as well to kind of provide some clarity on the employment aspect. So the Civil Rights Act protects applies to employees who have 15 or more employees. The Missouri Human Rights Act applies to employees who have 6 or more employees. So right now in Missouri, because of the SCOTUS decision, I can't get denied employment based on my race at an employer who employs 6 or more people, but I can be denied employment based on my sexual orientation or gender identity if they employ less than 15 people. So I have protection depending on employer size based on certain identities. Puts that out of whack. It also would provide clear-cut guidelines. We talked about this patchwork about I have protections in St. Louis City, but not Jefferson City, protections in parts of St. Louis County, but not other parts of St. Louis County. I don't have protections in Springfield, but I have protections in Columbia. So we've got this patchwork of stuff that doesn't really work. So this would provide clear guidelines for everyone across the state and give our regional, municipal, state level equal opportunity commissions and human rights offices clear-cut policies and action steps for how to lodge and engage in those complaints. And it would allow us to do it at the state level or at the municipal level, as opposed to having to take it to the federal level, which would just inherently take longer.
So what I'm hearing, and I hope that we have other folks who are joining us this evening hearing that we not only do we obviously still need the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act, not only do we still need our beloved MONA to pass through the Missouri legislature, but now we have hopefully an even stronger argument, and we can build in across the aisle as we always have, but we can build even more because of the ruling. Do you feel like that we have we've kind of that bigger support now because of the ruling by chance?
Yes, definitely, because one thing that happens a lot in the Missouri legislature is that they want, to an extent, they want us to be in compliance or line up with federal policy. We don't want to be out of line because then we lose funding, we lose those logistical differences, and this case has a huge significant foundation for us to build an even stronger case for why we need MONA, to put us in compliance and line up with federal standards.
Fantastic. So what I'm hearing that this is like a supportive kind of push for our legislators who, you know, maybe aren't fully with us on the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act yet. Maybe this is the supportive and positive push that they needed. So, you know, we talk about the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act here in Missouri. You know, Stephen, what does this look like nationally? We've heard about the Equality Act. Can you speak just really quickly on that?
Yeah, so I will tackle the Equality Act. I just want to add additional point on our Missouri legislators or lawmakers as well, is just the fact that a lot of them want to have some cover as well. And I think that there's an opportunity, especially for those that are joining us today that, you know, may have representatives in Jefferson City that have not supported Mona before, the opportunity to kind of go in and talk about the decision that was written by Justice Gorsuch and being able to use some of his language within this case to really make the case for Mona going forward. So I think that there's really an opportunity to kind of say, you know, here's what's been decided at the highest level from a conservative justice, and being able to use some of that argument and some of that language to make that case to lawmakers that maybe have been on the fence or maybe just haven't, you know, wanted to take that next step. This might be an opportunity for them. So I just wanted to throw that in there. But as it pertains to the Equality Act, so this was a piece of legislation at the federal level. So it actually passed the House about a year ago. So May 17th of last year, the House actually passed the Equality Act 236 to 173, and I believe it had 8 or 9 Republicans that supported that piece of legislation, I believe with every Democrat. So a bipartisan piece of legislation that passed the House that has been just kind of stalled out in the Senate. So you know, I think it's an opportunity for us in a state like Missouri to, you know, talk to our, you know, senators in Washington, D.C. and kind of talk about the Equality Act and what that means for folks. One thing that I find really interesting about it, so they've done public polling around the Equality Act around the country, and it actually polls at 70% public support. So what I think we're finding is that opinion when it comes to non-discrimination, and certainly around gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender rights, the public is ahead of our lawmakers in a lot of places. And I think that public opinion has also been ahead of the courts in a lot of ways. You know, sometimes we've seen that at different levels or different layers throughout history, but it's got broad public support. It has a bipartisan vote in Congress. And really what this would do, I mean, the Equality Act, for those that don't know, it would actually amend parts of the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, as well as the Jury Selection and Services Act. So it's really a comprehensive piece of legislation that would deny discrimination against the LGBTQ community in employment, in housing, in credit, education, public spaces, federally funded programs, and jury service. So this is like a really good piece of legislation that, like, you know, Mona is fantastic at the state level. The Equality Act is a fantastic piece of legislation at the federal level. So those that are inclined to, you know, talk to their legislators and things like that, these are both really important conversations to be having with the representatives at the 2 different levels of government.
Fantastic. And I know, you know, we're talking, kind of leaning into talking to our legislators about these issues. And I'm really excited to kind of talk to everyone this evening a little bit about that and about what this means this November, what this means in 2021. But before I get really excited as field director talking about these conversations and actions that we can start taking because of this decision, you know, Samadi and Stephen, is there anything else that we need to also keep in mind that we haven't mentioned yet this evening? You are muted, Stephen.
Sorry about that. I pressed it 2 times instead of once. No, I think from my perspective, I think it's important for us to be continuously engaging in these conversations. So I'm really thankful for everyone that's joining tonight. I think it's important for us to be able to celebrate wins when we have them. I know, you know, we don't get enough wins, I feel like, in this movement. So I think it's important for us to be able to celebrate them in the moment. But to keep pressing forward. I know that there were a lot of people within the LGBTQ community that saw marriage equality for the huge win that it was, but understanding that that was just one step on the path to true equality. So there's so much left that has to be done, not just in legislation and the court system, but also, as we said, I think earlier, in hearts and minds. So encouraging people to continue to have these conversations and put this into context with where we find ourselves now. So understanding that, there are plenty of us that maybe haven't faced discrimination in our lives. I think for younger folks, sometimes we take some of this for granted. But there are many people within our community that are still facing a lot of discrimination. And it's important for us to be able to highlight that, to talk about it, and to make sure that we're engaging in these conversations anywhere and everywhere, I would say.
And I know that we've had a couple of questions come through as well with folks, in talking about some specifics on this ruling as well, if I can bring up a couple of those, if that's okay, team. And I know that those came up. And so we talked a little bit about, Samadi, you really highlighted that, this only affects employers who employ, I believe you said, at least 15 employees, this ruling does. The Missouri Non-Discrimination Act would help close a little bit of that gap, which I'm actually pretty confident, being the team member who is in Springfield and working in more rural areas in our state, that really would benefit rural Missourians so much, being able to close a little bit of that gap. What does this also mean for religious institutions in this state? Either, Samadi or Stephen, can you kind of explain what this means for religious institutions in the realm of employment as well?
Yeah, so religious institutions, so like religious universities and like private religious K through 12 schools, they have a lot of religious exemptions from the Civil Rights Act, from the Missouri Human Rights Act. So this doesn't affect them. This doesn't apply to them. So they would still be allowed to discriminate based on their religious exemption and their religious beliefs, not hiring me for my sexual orientation, possibly also my religion, technically speaking. But in other areas, someone's asking about K through 12 schools in a different way. But so someone asked previously about schools. Public schools or private schools that are not religious are covered under this. So they cannot discriminate either based on sexual orientation or gender identity in terms of their hiring practices for teaching staff or other aspects as well of school. Yeah.
And I think that this relates a little bit to what we were discussing before as well. This ruling and the definition of what sex discrimination is, and including sexual orientation and gender identity, will really help with Title IX, which directly impacts schools and access to schools, and trans students having access to the same activities, to the same facilities and things like that as their peers of the same gender. So we talked a little bit about the implications of this. So that's really, I think, as well, really rooted in how we can move forward with schools, in addition to some really great legislation that's been filed even just this year, inclusive curriculum bills and things like that have been filed here in the state by, Representative Martha Stevens, I know championed an inclusive curriculum bill this year. So there are several different avenues, one that can be affected by the ruling and one that looks like our legislation. Is that correct, Samadi?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, and I know I was just, because I've been trying to do a little bit more research. I am not an attorney, so I can't give legal advice. I just want to definitely preface by saying that. But, I think that there are two different religious exemptions as they exist under Title VII. So the one is that religious organization exemption that kind of gives organizations preference to members of their own religion. There's kind of a carve out there. And the other one that I think is a little more unclear to me, that I'd be curious to kind of get more information out from Promo's channels on this, is that ministerial exception. And I think that there might be a court case that's working its way through the system as to what exactly is deemed an essential religious function. So as it was kind of described to me, it's like, you have the opportunity to discriminate, I guess, a little bit further if someone is a minister, or maybe teaching like a religious studies course that's kind of incorporated into doctrine, versus someone that might be teaching math or something like that. So it'll be interesting to see that. And then one thing that I did note from Gorsuch's ruling, and I think that this is going to be one of those areas where we still talk a little bit about patchwork, especially as it pertains to religious freedom. So there was a line that he had in there that said, how these doctrines protecting religious liberty interact with Title VII are questions for future cases. So I think that this was a broad ruling in a lot of ways, but He even kind of made that comment in his ruling that there are going to be future court cases that seek to narrow this question down. And I think that that's something we've certainly seen in Supreme Court cases in the past is, you get kind of a broader ruling and then they get narrower as different cases work their way through the system. What I think is important for us to remember is that sometimes takes a long time, which again is why it's so important to have something like the Equality Act or MONA to have these protections in place sooner rather than relying on the court system to do it for us.
Thank you for that. Thanks, y'all. And I know we're continuing to get questions. And I know that some folks have submitted more questions. And as those come up, I will go ahead and make sure that we have those answered. But I also really wanted to take some time. A lot of us kind of wonder after something like this, well, what do we do now? What does this look like moving forward? Yes, you said that we still need MONA. Okay, we got it. But how do we get there? And so I'd love to talk a little bit about that. So first off, what can we do as voters? First, and even more first than that, is making sure that you're registered to vote. And we even have a Pride pledge to vote this year of Vote for Pride with Pride in 2020, if you haven't seen it. And the reason why we decided to focus on voting is because of the sheer impact that voting has, and specifically voting locally, and making sure that our state legislature represents the communities all across our beautiful state, and making sure that they understand that they have LGBTQ constituents, right? And the values of our districts as well, all across our state. So make sure that you are registered to vote. Make sure that check your registration, that it's up to date. Everything looks good. Feel free to take the pledge with us. And I not only am going to ask you, like Stephen mentioned, to talk to your legislators, your current legislators, maybe incumbents, if they're running again, talk to them about the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act, talk to them about what it means to be LGBTQ or an ally, if you are an ally, what that means to you and why LGBTQ equality is important to you. Many times, and Samadi, you can stop me, but it sounds like many times we actually have legislators who say, well, I don't think I have any LGBTQ constituents. They haven't talked to me, right? Has that happened before?
All the time.
So we gotta talk to them.
The number of times a legislator says my district doesn't, no one in my district cares, or I don't have any LGBTQ folks, is too often, too frequently.
And we already know that there are LGBTQ people in 99.9% of counties in the United States. So we know that that's simply not true. And so even if you're an ally, we implore you to please have these conversations, because it might be safer for you to have this conversation with your elected official than it is for an LGBTQ person in your district. So we also ask you, please have these conversations. And really that looks like asking them how they feel about the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act. Ask how they feel about the future of LGBTQ equality in our state. And not only talk to our elected officials, talk to all the candidates. Ask them, how do you feel about, LGBTQ equality? How do you feel about the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act? At Promo, we do have a pack where we're able to work with pro-equality candidates, and we're really excited to be able to roll out some endorsements, some equality champions who've been doing work with us, things like that. We'll have access to, folks who have completed our candidate survey that have reached 100%, all of that at Promo Pack. And we have a specific website that'll have all that information that'll be rolling out very soon. But regardless of whether or not someone shows up on that, please reach out and ask, how do you feel about the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act? How do you feel about these issues that matter to you? Maybe not just the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act. We have folks who are asking about education right now, inclusive curriculum. Ask that question, because when you have those conversations, that continues during legislative session for us to be able to move pro-equality legislation forward. And so then we can finally pass the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act and focus on even more legislation that will continue to protect Missourians. So
some employees driving his truck.
So that's really what we ask you all to do. If you haven't registered to vote, please register to vote. If you have registered, check it. If you haven't checked your registration, and start to have really these conversations with legislators and with candidates about LGBTQ equality. And so we ask you to continue to do that. Continue to stay in touch with us. We will be rolling out different events even throughout the end of Pride Month. So if you don't follow us on social media and you're active on social media, please follow us. I know many of you got an email about today. We'll continue to alert you as we have more resources. We've had Pride Online and our promo at home before Pride Month, and we're really going to talk about what this work looks like moving forward and pulling everyone in. So that's really what I'm seeing for our future actions. Really get involved and get engaged if you haven't already engaged. And I'm also here to inform you, and I'm sure Samadi can affirm this, but our candidates and our elected officials are not intimidating whatsoever. And when you talk to them about LGBTQ issues, it is more than likely that you are the expert. You are the expert in your own story. Share your own story. Share the stories of people you love when you have permission, of course, and really talk about this. It is not intimidating as it might sound. Samadi, do you have any tips about what a conversation could look like when contacting our legislators about equality?
Whether or not your legislator is friendly, like whether or not you think they're supportive or friendly, a lot of them are willing to learn. Yes, many of them wear a suit and tie or dress very formally and talk about how they're a lawyer, but a lot of them are very much approachable. My job every day when we're in session and there isn't a pandemic is to go talk to almost all of them pretty regularly, and they're, to my surprise, really, really approachable.
Yeah, that's what they're here for. They're here to represent the district. You're part of the district, have these conversations. And I also ask young people, if you are too young to vote, that doesn't mean that you cannot have conversations with your elected officials. Please continue to have conversations. Even if you are a young person, I have to say, this session was proof to that. That young people have such beautiful voices and strong voices and experiences that deserve to be heard by their representatives and their state senators. That was really, like I said, proof this session when we had countless young people who came to testify in what is an intimidating situation. And so we continue to ask you to have those conversations as well. In district, send an email, make a call. Those are all important regardless of your age. They need to hear that we have LGBTQ Missourians of all ages that our legislators represent. So I think I'm going to create some space. I know that we are looking towards some questions that maybe have come in a little bit about this ruling, about the future of equality here in Missouri moving forward. So I'm going to give a little bit of space for some questions. And if we don't have any that come through, I think that we've really closed out a great night, hopefully comprehensive in answering some of those burning little caveats about the ruling, about what this means for us moving forward here at Promo. We're really working hard to make sure that we can achieve full equality in all areas of law and the hearts and minds of Missourians. So we got your back here. And while we wait for those questions, Stephen, is there anything else that, when looking towards the future, that you see for us as an organization, whether that be the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act and the legislature?
One thing I wanted to include, because I think that there was a comment in the chat box on this as well, is I think we referenced a little bit, if you have found yourself in a situation where you have faced discrimination, those stories are important, and also the legal implications of that. So I would say, please reach out to Promo. We can connect you with people that can help you if you find yourself in one of those situations. And on the flip side of that, I know, we have attorneys and other experts that often join our calls. And if you have that experience, also reach out to us. We would love to connect with you and be able to find where those commonalities are and where those threads and where we can connect people that need the resources and have the resources available. So I think that I like to see ourselves at Promo as a connector for people in that respect too. So, though we're not, seen as a direct service provider, we can connect people to resources that they need.
That's definitely it. All right, Samadi, I got a question for you that came in. Do you expect a backlash against the SCOTUS opinion this next year in the Missouri legislature?
Unfortunately, yes. The 19 bills that we saw this year, and the additional other attacks on LGBTQ folks was unprecedented is tossed on way too much, but like the definition of unprecedented, there was no like triggering thing. There wasn't like a reason for a lot of that legislation. It just showed up. And as we've seen with like marriage equality decisions in the courts, and other laws, the pendulum, as the former president always says, swings the other direction. So I think we are anticipating a lot of religious freedom cases, a lot of like laws that roll back what little discrimination protections we have. Unfortunately, we definitely anticipate a lot of the anti-transgender bills returning in some way, shape, or form, attacking transition-related medical care for youth, trans participation in athletics, stuff like that is likely to come up again, unfortunately. But I don't want to be too overconfident, but we defeated all of those bills once and we can do it again. So
I think the key difference this year is that this time last year, we weren't having this conversation about a slew of anti-bills. And so we were not prepared. I mean, no one in the country was prepared for the amount of anti-LGBTQ legislation that was filed in each state. This was shocking to us nationwide. It's just so happened that in Missouri, we led the nation in anti-LGBTQ legislation. We were able to stop every single piece of legislation. Thank you, Samadi. Thank you to our tireless advocates who joined us in Jefferson City. But I think the fact that we have this knowledge now and that we're having this conversation now here in June of 2020 means that we'll be all that much more prepared in December during pre-filing, and then in January of 2021 going into that Capitol, knowing how we can make sure that LGBTQ Missourians not only keep the protections that we have, but then we are further protected in the gaps that we do not have. Does that sound right, Samadi, that we have more of a positive outlook, just knowing what to expect, being able to move forward?
Yeah, definitely. And I want to say two things. One, it was not just me, it was Karis and our communications manager, Shira Berkowitz, as well. It was not just me. So we made a good team. And yeah, this time last year, we were kind of like, oh, this may come up. This may be a thing that happens. We were kind of hearing it from national orgs that like, this is what may happen. Even national orgs were like, we do not know. There were going to be like 20 athlete bills that would attack trans kids across the country. We know what the legislature is willing to do and not willing to do now. We weren't quite in the same place last year, as Karis said. Our big push this past year was going to be to work on building votes for Mona. We had to completely shift that strategy and work on a lot of other things. And we did that in the moment with 6 additional months of preparation, knowing what could be coming and what is going to be coming down. It will still be hard, but we will be ready.
Thank you for that, Samadi. All right, I think that can kind of conclude. I don't have any more questions that are coming in. So I think that concludes us for this evening of really having a discussion on our true celebration here of the ruling on Title VII and making sure that you cannot be denied employment for your sexual orientation, gender identity in our country, and that also means in our state, and really being able to map out the road to equality moving forward. So I'll allow, Stephen, Samadi, if you have any closing remarks, but I just really want to take time to thank everyone for joining us this evening for a conversation. Hopefully we're able to answer some of the questions that you have. Know that if you have any more burning questions, that the promo team is here for you. Please go to promoonline.org and get a hold of us. Like I said, we have a report discrimination form that we can help you through. And then we also have other ways to contact us if it's about something completely different, and we can get you connected. So I'll let, Samadi, Stephen, feel free to say anything closing, but we've got some good news and a good path.
Yeah, so I'll just make one last comment. I think I kind of alluded to this at the top, but I think one of the worries we had before this ruling came down is what it would look like if this wasn't as clear of a decision as it was. And I think that some of the commentary that I've seen in the wake of this ruling is that we're really stronger together than we are apart. And I think that the way that they bound sexual orientation and gender identity into this ruling and making it very clear that that's what sex discrimination means in this country, I think really provided us an opportunity to really bring the full LGBTQ community together in a way that maybe some of the other court cases before hadn't. So I think it's an opportunity for us to really reflect. I think one of the things that we see, and I'm sure Samadhi sees this all the time in Jefferson City, is that opponents to our movement always seek to divide us. And it's so important for us to be standing up in solidarity with each other. So what I would just encourage people in this time is just to understand that this is a big win for our community, but there's still a significant portion of our community that's being left behind. So I just want to say, kind of on behalf of myself, on behalf of Promo, that now is the opportunity for us to stand in solidarity with Black members of the LGBTQ community, and specifically Black trans people within our community, and that we are here for you, just as you've been here for us, and really led this movement to get us to this point, to be able to allow us to have these types of wins on behalf of the community. So I think it's just really important for us, and really important for me to always be thinking of that, and really just wanted to close my comments understanding the significance.
Karis may close with this as well, but as Karis said before, the importance and the power of voting cannot be underestimated. The people that are in the Capitol now that are elected there are there because of who voted or who did not vote. And we have the power as individuals and as a community to change that when necessary. So please register to vote, please vote. As Karis also said, ask the candidates about things you care about, whether it's MONA, whether it's conversion therapy, whether it's improving K through 12 schools, whether it's Medicaid expansion. These are things that they need to be held accountable for and to.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, everyone. And then I will just plug one more thing. I said that we have a Pride Online happening. We have events that are going to be rolling out. Tomorrow at 4 p.m. is our last Yoga for the People. And that's that you can join us on, I believe, Facebook Live. We've been having it on there. You can even see the past yogas for the people that we've had. And I ask you to join us. We want to take this time as well to honor and be present and create space for ourselves, people to move forward as well. So thank you, everyone who's joined us. All of you are absolutely amazing from all across the state. And I'm excited to be able to move forward towards equality together.